All right, everybody, welcome back for another deep dive.
Yeah.
Today, we're going to be tackling the world of business.
Okay.
Specifically, we're going to be looking at this podcast that we found that goes through the book, The Personal MBA by Josh Kaufman. Have
Cool.
you ever heard of that?
I have heard of that. Yeah, it's kind of classic.
Yeah, it's basically like this idea that you don't need to go and get a really expensive MBA
Right.
to be successful in business.
Exactly.
And so this podcast we found kind of dives into the main ideas of the book.
Okay. Awesome. Yeah.
And it's really cool because it takes this pretty dense book
Mm-hmm.
and makes it really approachable.
I like that.
Yeah. And so I think one of the most interesting things that the podcast talks about right off the bat is that
Okay.
this idea that you don't actually need a formal business education to succeed in business.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of like the whole street smarts versus book smarts thing, right?
Totally. Yeah.
You can learn a lot just by doing and experiencing things firsthand.
Absolutely. And I think that's kind of what this whole book and podcast are all about.
Yeah.
It's all about practical application and getting your hands dirty.
Mm-hmm.
So instead of just reading about business theory in a textbook, it's actually going out there and starting a business or, working on a project or whatever.
Right. And I think that's something that a lot of people can relate to. No matter what field you're in, you learn so much more by actually doing the work
Oh, yeah, for sure.
than you do just by studying it in a classroom.
Yeah. And that's something I think the book and podcast both do a really good job of is actually giving you practical advice that you can use right away.
Yeah,
Or
absolutely.
it's not just theoretical stuff. It's okay, here's how you actually do this thing.
I like that.
So, one of the core things that the book and podcast talk about is this 5-part business framework.
Okay, 5 parts. What are they?
So the 5 parts are value creation, marketing, sales, finance, and management. And basically this is the foundation of any successful business.
Gotcha. So these are the 5 essential skills you need to master.
Yeah, exactly. And even if you're not an entrepreneur or, running your own business,
Right.
these are still really valuable skills to have in any career.
Yeah, for sure.
Knowing how to create value, how to market yourself, how to sell your ideas,
Mm,
how to manage your finances, all of that stuff is super important.
totally. And the cool thing is that these skills are transferable. You can use them in your personal life too.
Oh, absolutely.
Managing your personal finances is basically the same as managing business finances.
Right.
It's all about budgeting and making smart decisions.
Yeah, for sure.
So let's dive into these 5 parts a bit more. What did the podcast say about value creation?
Okay, so value creation is basically all about figuring out what people want and then giving it to them.
Okay, so it's solving a problem for someone.
Exactly.
Huh.
And the podcast talked about this concept called the iron law of the market.
The iron law of the market, that sounds intense.
It's actually pretty simple. Basically it means that if nobody wants what you're selling, you don't have a business.
Right. That makes sense.
It doesn't matter how much you love your product or how hard you worked on it.
Mm-hmm.
If there's no demand for it, you're not going to make any money.
That's a good point. It's you could have the best product in the world, but if nobody wants it, it's worthless.
Right. And I think that's something that a lot of entrepreneurs forget or overlook.
Mm.
They get so caught up in their own ideas that they don't stop to think about whether or not anyone actually needs or wants what they're creating.
Right. And I think the podcast had some good examples of that, that story about the guy who invented some super complicated gadget, but then nobody wanted to buy it.
Yeah, that was a good one.
Yeah, it's he spent all this time and money developing this thing, but he never actually bothered to ask anyone if they would actually use it.
Totally. And I think that's why market research is so important.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Before you even start building a product or creating a service, you need to figure out if there's actually a market for it.
Makes sense. So you're not just wasting your time and energy.
Exactly.
So once you've figured out what people want and you've created something valuable, the next step is marketing.
Right. And I think a lot of people get marketing wrong.
Oh, yeah. In what way?
They think it's all about being loud and flashy and trying to trick people into buying stuff.
Right, those annoying commercials that just scream at you.
Exactly. But good marketing is actually about building relationships and trust with your audience.
Okay, so it's more about connecting with people and showing them how your product or service can help them.
Yes, exactly. And the podcast talked about how important it is to understand your target audience.
Okay.
Who are they? What are their needs?
Right.
What are their pain points?
Right, so you can tailor your message to them specifically.
Yeah, and once you understand your target audience, you can start creating marketing materials that actually resonate with them.
So it's like speaking their language and addressing their specific concerns.
Exactly. And that's way more effective than just like blasting out generic messages to everyone.
For sure, because people are more likely to pay attention to something that feels relevant to them.
Absolutely. And that's how you build trust and loyalty.
Makes sense. So after marketing comes sales, right?
Yep. And sales is another area where I think a lot of people get it wrong.
Oh, yeah. How so?
They think it's all about like being pushy and aggressive and like trying to close the deal no matter what.
Right, like those sleazy salespeople who just won't take no for an answer.
Totally. But good
Yeah.
sales is actually about like helping people.
Okay.
Like it's about understanding their needs and then showing them how your product or service can solve their problems.
So it's like a consultative approach where you're actually providing value to the customer.
Exactly. And the podcast talked about how important it is to build rapport with your prospects.
Okay.
Like you need to establish trust and credibility before you can even start talking about your product.
That makes sense because people are more likely to buy from someone they like and trust.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to be genuine and authentic in your sales approach.
So it's not about being fake or putting on a show, it's about being yourself and building a real connection with the customer.
Yeah, I think when you take that approach, sales becomes a lot less about like manipulation and a lot more about like helping people.
Right, because you're genuinely trying to find the best solution for their needs.
Exactly.
So after sales, we have finance.
Yeah. And this is the part that a lot of entrepreneurs dread.
Oh, yeah. I can see why numbers can be intimidating.
Yeah. But the podcast actually did a really good job of breaking down some key financial concepts.
Okay, like what?
So they talked about things like cash flow profit and loss statements and balance sheets.
Right, those are the basics of business finance.
Yeah. And they explained it all in a way that was like really easy to understand.
So even if you're not a finance expert, you can still get a grasp of the fundamentals.
Exactly. And they also shared some practical tips for managing your finances,
Okay, like what?
like how to create a budget, track your expenses, and price your products effectively.
Right, because those are all crucial for staying afloat financially.
Absolutely. And I think the podcast host made a really good point about how, like, even if you're not like super passionate about finance,
Mm-hmm.
you still need to have a basic understanding of it.
Yeah, because it's essential for running a successful business.
Totally. Like, you don't need to be a CPA or anything,
Right.
but you do need to know how to manage your money.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
So the last part of framework is management.
Right. And this is all about like leading and organizing people.
Okay.
And the podcast talked about how important it is to have good systems and processes in place.
Right, because that helps everything run smoothly.
Exactly. And they also emphasized the importance of delegation.
Okay.
Like as a business owner or manager, you can't do everything yourself.
Right, you need to learn how to let go and trust other people.
Exactly. And that can be really hard for some people.
Oh, yeah. Especially if you're used to doing everything yourself.
Yeah, but it's essential for growth.
For sure, because you can't scale a business if you're trying to do everything yourself.
Absolutely. And the podcast had some really good tips for effective delegation,
Okay, like what?
like how to identify tasks that you can delegate, how to choose the right people to delegate to, and how to give clear instruction.
Right, those are all key elements of delegation.
Yeah, and when you delegate effectively, it frees you up to focus on the things that you're best at.
Exactly, and it allows your team to grow and develop their skills.
Totally. So
Mhm.
overall, I thought this podcast was a really great overview of the Personal MBA.
Yeah, me too. It was really informative and engaging.
And I think it's a great resource for anyone who's interested in starting or growing a business.
For sure, or even if you just want to improve your business acumen in general.
Absolutely. And even though we just scratched the surface here,
Mm-hmm.
I think this podcast gave us a lot of great food for thought.
Yeah, definitely. And it's a good reminder that you don't need a fancy degree to be successful in business.
Right? It's all about learning and applying the right skills.
Exactly. And those are skills that anyone can develop.
Totally. So to wrap things up, I have a question for our listeners.
Okay, shoot.
If you could choose just one of these 5 business skills to focus on this week, which one would it be?
That's a good question.
Yeah. And what's one small step you can take today to start mastering that skill?
I like that it's all about taking action.
Absolutely. So let us know in the comments what you're going to focus on.
We'd love to hear from you.
And that's it for today's deep dive. Thanks for listening.
Thanks, everyone.
We'll catch you next time.
See ya.